So what happens when a president issues an executive order, a directive that pretty much has the force of law, and it runs smack into the court system? Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating and recent clash between the White House and the judiciary, all centered on one single executive action. Okay, let's get right into it.
At the end of the day, this whole story boils down to a huge question about American government. Just how much power does a president really have to change or maybe even get rid of parts of the government with just the stroke of a pen? Well, that very question was just put to the test in a major way.
So, where did this all begin? It started with a direct action from the executive branch. An order was issued, and that single order set off a chain reaction that was felt all across Washington and really beyond.
Okay, let's look at the timeline. On March 14, 2025, Executive Order 14238 was signed. Then, less than a week later, it was officially published in the Federal Register. That's the step that makes it a formal, official directive for the entire federal government. So, what did it actually say?
Well, if you read the order itself, the stated purpose, right there in Section 1, was to continue the reduction of federal bureaucracy elements the president has determined are unnecessary. Now, that's some pretty dense language, but basically, it frames the whole thing as a move to create a smaller, more streamlined government by cutting away what the administration saw as the non-essential parts.
So, beyond the official purpose, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were the specific commands here? What did this order actually set in motion?
To really get what's going on, you have to understand this key term, non-statutory functions. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. These are the jobs an agency does that aren't explicitly required by a law passed by Congress. And this order took direct aim at exactly those functions.
And this wasn't some broad, vague directive for the whole government. Nope. This order was incredibly specific. It was laser-focused on these 7 agencies you see here, including groups like the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, but also cultural institutions like the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. And that one's going to become really important in just a minute.
The plan laid out was designed to be fast and decisive. Step 1. These 7 agencies were ordered to eliminate all their non-statutory functions. Step 2, they were given just 7 days to report back to the White House's Office of Management and Budget, that's the OMB, to confirm they had done it. And then Step 3, the OMB was ordered to reject any funding requests that went against the new directive. I mean, this was a very, very fast-moving plan.
Now, you can bet that an executive action this significant was going to get a reaction. And it did, very quickly. And that's when the conflict moved out of the halls of government and into the courtroom. The lawsuit was filed by 2 major groups. The American Library Association, which makes sense since its members rely heavily on grants from the IMLS, one of the targeted agencies, and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which is a major public employee union. They decided to team up and challenge the legality of the entire order. And just like that, the legal battle lines were drawn. On one side, you had the administration, which argued that the order was simply telling agencies to do only what Congress explicitly told them to do. They said it was an internal executive branch matter, and the courts had no business getting involved. On the other side, the plaintiffs argued that a president just can't unilaterally shut down an agency that Congress created. They said a move that drastic requires a clear, well-reasoned explanation, which they claim was missing. So, with both sides having made their case, the decision landed in the lap of a federal judge. And that judge had to make a tough call: intervene right away or let the order move forward while the case was being argued. And this quote from U.S. District Judge Richard Leon really gets to the core of his decision. He said, "These harms are neither speculative nor remediable." What he's saying there in plain English is that the potential damage from this order, things like grants being canceled, people losing their jobs, was real, it was immediate, and it couldn't just be undone later on. So, based on that reasoning, the judge issued what's called a temporary restraining order. The stated goal was simply to preserve the status quo. You can think of it like hitting a giant pause button on the whole process, stopping any more steps from being taken while the lawsuit itself could actually unfold. So you might be asking, what exactly is a temporary restraining order, or a TRO? Well, it's a short-term, kind of emergency court order. It is not a final verdict on who's right or wrong. It's just designed to freeze everything in place to prevent immediate damage until the court has time to hold a full, proper hearing on the whole issue. Okay, so let's zoom out. What does all of this mean for the bigger picture? Because this specific case, it's about more than just a handful of federal agencies. It's really a test of the fundamental balance of power in our system of government.
What this lawsuit and the judge's ruling have created is a direct standoff. This is a real-time textbook example of the judicial branch stepping in to place a check on an action taken by the executive branch. It's pretty much the definition of checks and balances playing out right before our eyes. And all of that leaves us with this final, really critical question. Of course, the story is still developing, but this case forces all of us to ask, what does this kind of clash really tell us about the boundaries and the limits of presidential power in this day and age?